You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Hello and welcome back to Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we're here to talk, obviously, creation, because that's the name of the show. Paul, I was out and about in public the other day, now that I have been fully vaccinated and feel, invincible. So I went out in public. It's graduation time, and a friend of mine came up and said, "You're famous now." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, I listened to you on your podcast." And I thought, "Oh, okay." So apparently our podcast is making an impact, and we're now famous, which I didn't know we were before. Maybe we were.
Well, there you go.
I don't know.
No, but it's great, isn't it, that we're getting good feedback, and
it is.
That we're glad to hear that people are enjoying what we're doing. So.
And we've made a huge splash with Cain's wife.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. I think in about 3 weeks since that one clip about Cain's wife was uploaded to our YouTube channel, it's had almost 1,900 views, which is, by far the most engaged with piece of content that we've produced so far.
Yeah, twice as popular as the next thing. Yeah.
But if you've discovered the podcast because, you found that clip about Cain's wife, then welcome. We're very glad to have you.
And come along and we will blow your mind with other things as well. Today is going to be kind of a mind blower, I think. Maybe we'll be getting some angry email. I don't know. That'll be fun. So today's discussion, we got multitude of different things that are all sort of feeding into this. But today's discussion is all about the vapor canopy theory. And maybe, Paul, you could give us a really very brief description of what in the world the vapor canopy theory is, to start off with.
Okay, so the vapor canopy theory is a kind of venerable creationist idea that was particularly popularized by Whitcomb and Morris in the Genesis flood, but it has a history that goes back well before that. And it basically says that before the flood, there was a canopy of water vapor in the atmosphere of the Earth, which helped to keep the Earth uniformly warm and promoted health and longevity on the Earth, and that it collapsed at the time of the flood to give the 40 days and nights of rain, and thus contributed to the floodwaters. So that's the vapor canopy theory, and it's a very popular idea in creationism even to this day.
Okay. So if we were to go back to, say, Genesis 1, this would be sort of an interpretation of the creation of the firmament, or the creation of the expanse, where God divided the waters below from the waters above. And so the waters above the waters above the expanse, or above the heavens, this is interpreted to be this vapor canopy, right? So
yeah, that's right.
And then this is also said to be the source, as you say, the 40 days of rain. It's the source of it's the source of the floodwater, essentially. It's how the earth could flood. Yeah, so it's an old idea. So it shows up. We know it shows up in the Genesis flood. We know it shows up in a couple of other creationist publications as well. But that's not where it came from. What is there an origin of this theory, or how far back does it really go?
Well, arguably, it goes back to the time of Jerome, one of the church fathers, who speculated about the idea that there might have been some kind of water canopy, ice canopy. I can't remember the details now, but something
Sure.
like that.
Sure.
And then there was a guy called Isaac Vale, and I have a modern reprint of Vale here. The Waters Above the Firmament.
Okay.
Vale, I think, was in the early 20th century, end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And he, drawing on some ideas of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher,
Okay.
speculated about there being some kind of canopy of water, or perhaps a series of canopies, perhaps somewhat similar to the ice rings or dust rings around Saturn, around the planets,
yeah.
other planets. And the collapse of the last of these canopies was what produced the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. Now, Vale was an old Earth
Yeah, I was
guy.
going to
He
say that
wasn't- he
sounds like
wasn't
an
a
old
young
Earth
Earth
idea.
creationist.
Right.
Yeah, so I think he had
So
a
it
whole
gets
kind of succession of canopies.
Right. So it gets adapted then by, is it Wickham and Morris that do the adapting? Something like that? They certainly had it in their book,
Yeah.
The Genesis Flood. Right.
Yeah, they did. Again, I think there are others. Ray Winkle in his book The Flood in 1951
Yep.
also talks about a canopy idea, and he seems to get his idea from the writings of a German called Johannes Riem, and I have
Whoa.
a copy of one of Riem's volumes here. Now, I haven't been able to read this because it's in German, and it would be fantastic to have a translation of this. But that seems to be one of the sources that Ray Winkle is using.
So this is not just a sort of a late 20th century gimmick that creationists thought up. This has been around a long time, and people have been
Yeah.
discussing this for quite some time.
Yeah.
So for me, the definitive version, I think, perhaps the most recent version that I am familiar with came from a guy named Dillo. If you're watching on YouTube, you may recognize this book. It's called The Waters Above, and it's published in 81 by Moody Bible Institute, and it was essentially a summary of Dillo's dissertation from Dallas Theological Seminary. And if you know anything about American seminaries, Dallas Theological Seminary is very well known as a sort of conservative, kind of a dispensationalist seminary, highly esteemed among sort of American evangelical Christians. And Dillo's dissertation, I have a copy of that as well. It's a curious read because there's an enormous amount of science and equations and chemical formulas. It does not read like a typical seminary dissertation in any way. But the structure of the book, of the Waters Above, basically follows the structure and content of his dissertation. And in the dissertation, he lays out his biblical case and then talks about some scientific issues that he feels are also explained by this vapor canopy. So he's got, he talks about frozen mammoths in Siberia and how that must have taken place very rapidly, and so he links that to the sudden collapse of the vapor canopy. He talks about a variety of different scriptures. He talks about the the rainbow after the flood, and he implies that this must mean that there were no rainbows before the flood. He uses the lack of seasons, which I find kind of peculiar because, of course, when God creates the sun, moon, and stars, he explicitly mentions the seasons. But Dillo argues that that's really just a period of time and should not be understood as the cycle of cold and hot and wet and dry that we experience as seasons, which honestly strikes me as a bit of special pleading. But there you go. So Dillo's book and Dillo's argument, oh yeah, he also mentions longevity. He mentions longevity with respect to the idea that the vapor canopy, he believes, would shield the Earth from damaging radiation from the sun and thereby potentially remove environmental conditions that might have led to early death, right? So it would allow people to live for 900 years rather than die at 70 years like we do now, 70 or 80. Should also point out, it's interesting because he later on published a paper in the Quarterly where he sort of walked back that idea and said, maybe that's not right, and he talked about some of the genetic work that had been done, and so he was himself beginning to sort of think that might not be the case. But in his dissertation, he definitely mentions it. So he creates this argument for the vapor canopy that is, well, in terms of what we've talked about here on the podcast, Paul, he's built a model, right? We talked about him building a model before, and that's exactly what he's done. He has drawn together different ideas about climate, ideas about what caused the flood, different passages of Scripture, and all of these different things that you would think are perhaps not related at all. He ties them together with this one rather simple idea, the idea that there is this massive canopy, and it shielded the Earth and changed the climate, and then it collapsed at the flood, and so now the climate is different. Oh, drunkenness, I forgot. He brought in Noah's drunkenness too, because apparently fermentation of alcohol is slower in higher pressure environments. So that when Noah went to drink his wine, he did not know how much of a punch that would pack. And so it's not Noah's fault. So lots of different ideas put forward, and they all tie together in a way that you and I would call conciliant, right? The idea of different disparate things, pieces of evidence that all get sort of explained by a single concept or a single idea that is the model, right? And so in the time that followed Dillo's work, there has been a bit of critique of his ideas. So, Paul, could you give us a really brief, very short rundown of exactly what the problem is? And then we'll get more detail here later on. But give us a brief rundown of that.
Yeah, so, I mean, the first thing to say is that there's a lot about what Dillo was doing that kind of resonates with us, as you say, because he was trying to build a model, and he was building on what Whitcomb and Morris were doing. They were also trying to, posit a model that could explain lots of geological data. So that's all very positive. But it turns out that there are some really quite serious problems with Dillo's model. Some of them are biblical critiques. So some people have pointed out that many of the biblical passages that he draws on to develop this model actually are probably best understood in other ways. And scientifically, one of the big problems with the model is that if you simulate what happens when you have a lot of water vapor in the Earth's upper atmosphere, one of the outcomes is that the greenhouse effect means that the sun's radiation, absorbed by the Earth and then re-radiated, is trapped by the vapor canopy, and it raises surface temperatures on the Earth to intolerable levels, so that life basically wouldn't be possible. Everything would get fried, and various parameters in the model have sort of been tweaked and changed to try to see if this problem can be resolved, but nobody's really come up with a solution to that yet.
Right.
So that's the big scientific problem.
Right. So you can either have a very small canopy that actually doesn't do anything that the model claims that it does, or you can have the canopy that could produce the floodwaters, in which case we would all burn up from the heat. So, and this objection was raised fairly quickly. So I have a copy here of Creation Research Society Quarterly. This one is December 1979, and it contains one of the first real criticisms I found by Glenn Morton. And Glenn was a young Earth creationist who eventually abandoned young Earth creationism. He did not abandon his Christian faith, but he stopped being a young Earth creationist. And Glenn basically comes to the same conclusion. If you have a canopy like that, it would burn everything up on the surface of the Earth, which that's not good. Now, so if you're thinking about the chronology here, so Dillow publishes his dissertation in 78 at Dallas Seminary. Glenn Morton publishes his critique in the Quarterly in 79, and in 1980, Dillow releases The Waters Above through Moody Press. So there's a bit of back and forth in the Quarterly with Dillow and Morton talking about who's got the right math and who's correctly understood the model and so forth. So even at the time that Dillow proposed, or at the time that Dillow wrote his dissertation and was promoting this idea, creationists had already begun to question whether this was really going to work. Nevertheless, the canopy theory has taken an esteemed place in the cultural memory of creationists. I'm part of various creationist discussion groups on the internet, and I was watching a discussion of the canopy theory the other day, and a prominent, well-known creationist employed by a well-known creationist organization got into this bizarre argument with one of the members of the forum, who was saying that the vapor canopy model was the model of the flood, and all the creationist organizations promoted this. And this individual who works for the creationist organization said, no, that's incorrect. None of the creationist organizations promote this model anymore, and it's largely for the reasons that you mentioned, Paul. And it was just so weird to me to see this happening, where this fellow who, I don't know who he was, but he was sure that the guy who works for the Creation Ministries did not know what the Creation Ministries were teaching. So it's out there, in the ether of creationism, and people still think that it's true. And on the other hand, I've heard numerous testimonies of people who claim that the vapor canopy model was one of the reasons why they're not creationists anymore. And I think Glenn Morton would probably put the Canopy theory in there as one of those factors that drove him out of creationism. And I've heard a number of other individuals, and again, some prominent theologians who are sort of old Earth creationists, who decided that young Earth creationism was wrong because the Canopy model was incorrect. Or perhaps they just felt like people were being a little too possessive of a model that was very uncertain. So this is near and dear to a lot of people's heart. Do you find that in England? I definitely find it here in America.
Yeah, I still get asked about the vapor canopy theory. It comes up in question times after talks that I go out and give, and it's hard, isn't it, to kind of disillusion people and and tell them actually, you know, that the creationists who are at the coalface, you know, the ones who are doing the research and the main creation organisations aren't holding to the vapor canopy model anymore, and that's news to a lot of people. But so is it news that, you know, we don't believe in the Paluxy River footprints, and there's so many of these kinds of ideas that are out there in the popular consciousness, and once they're out there, they're just very hard to displace. And if people aren't reading the literature and aren't keeping up with it, you know, you can understand they read a book back in the 70s, you know, and they thought that, you know, they identified that as creationism.
Right.
And so it's hard for them to sort of break out of that box and think in a different way. And I think it just reminds us, doesn't it, of the need for us to separate out what the Bible actually teaches from scientific models. That those scientific models that we construct, you know, we want them to be consistent with the Bible, but they're not actually the same thing as the Bible. These models are human constructs, and they may or may not be correct.
Right.
And we have to be willing to let them go, you know, if they turn out to be mistaken or fatally flawed in some way, as it seems the vapor canopy model was.
Right. And I, you know, I'd add to that, in terms of science is pretty young. And even modern science, the scale of knowledge that we have today about the Earth and the solar system, a lot of that has been generated in my lifetime. I remember as a kid seeing images of the solar system from Voyager. So we've gained an enormous amount of information about the world we inhabit just in the past 50 years. And so it doesn't surprise me that creationist models are wrong.
No.
Of course they will be, because we're just, it's as if we're almost just starting out, right? We're just now getting all of this data and really being able to start playing with it and thinking about it. And we have computers now that can do pretty good physical modeling, and we're going to talk about that also in a future episode.
And it really surprises me, Todd, you know, that you do get some very thoughtful people who, as you say, have abandoned young age creationism altogether, because the vapor canopy theory turned out to be incorrect. And that, I find that very strange, because you know, look at what mainstream science was saying 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's very different to what's being said now.
That's right.
You know, plate tectonics is a relatively young model. It basically arose in the 60s and 70s because of studies of the ocean floor. The whole story that I learnt as a student at university about the way that granites were formed has been revolutionised today. The whole story about tetrapod evolution is radically different than it was just a few decades ago. So why would we throw out the whole of creationism because this model has been abandoned or replaced with something else. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
It shows to me a kind of fundamental misunderstanding of how science works.
Yeah. And in a sense, a fundamental misunderstanding of what creationism ought to be, right? Creationism is not, I mean, I don't think we should think of creationism as being sort of the answer to evolution, where I can give an answer on every point and evolution has no evidence and we have all the evidence. That's, I think, a really dangerous way of thinking, because evolutionists are really clever and creative and they have lots of answers for everything. And so we need to be honest, I think, about, we're at the beginning and things are going to be wrong, and that doesn't mean that our interpretations are wrong. I think it's always valuable to go back and think, am I reading the Bible right? And have I got my understanding of creation correct? But at the end of the day, I feel pretty confident that my understanding, my young age creation understanding of creation is right. And so then the question is, well, what then does the rest of this, what does the rest of it mean? How do we work in the physics of the flood and so forth, the atmospheric science of the flood? So yeah, I think it's important, like you say, to hold on to our scientific models very loosely. Be willing to roll with it, because a lot of them are going to be wrong. I think some of them are closer to the truth than others, but I think all of them are, everything that we believe nowadays about God's creation is probably going to change pretty dramatically in the next 50 years, just because science is going to keep producing more data, and creation scientists are going to continue to try to interpret and understand that data within the context of creationism. And that's good. That's exactly what should happen.
Yeah. Well.
All right. Well, we're gonna pause here for a second for a little word from our sponsor, and when we come back, we have a special guest. You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information about any of the subjects discussed in the show, please visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org.
Is Genesis History is the film that is a first step on a journey toward understanding the history of the Earth according to Genesis. Follow along with narrator Del Tackett as he travels across the continent with over a dozen scientists and scholars to see fascinating new evidence of creation and a global flood. This film is free to watch on the Is Genesis History YouTube page, along with all the Beyond features which dig deeper into young Earth creationism. Be sure to check out the New Creation blog as well, which is sponsored by the film, at newcreation.blog. That's newcreation.blog. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
All right, welcome back. We have with us a special guest now, a senior professor of physics at Cedarville University. He's also on the board of the International Conference on Creationism, and he is Steve Golmer. So, Dr. Golmer, welcome.
Good to be here, Todd. Paul?
Yeah, it's great to see you, Steve.
Yeah, so he has worked a lot, done a lot of research in. He's sort of picked up the mantle for studying the atmospheric effects of the flood, and so, Dr. Gollmer, why don't you just fill us in on that? Tell us more about what your work is, and then we'll get more into the physics of the canopy theory. But just tell us more about yourself.
Okay. Well, my original training was at a small Bible college, actually as a teacher. And then after finishing up my student teaching, I realized I wanted to teach at the college level. So I went through the process of getting a master's in physics and then a PhD in atmospheric science. And so with regards to our topic today, the atmospheric science plays very tightly in that. Ever since coming to Cedarville 27 years ago, I've been looking for ways of drawing my students into some research projects that are tied in with creation. And probably the one that I felt most qualified to work into was the issue of the Ice Age, the post-flood Ice Age. So Larry Vardaman had done a bit of work in that area, had used computer climate models to do that. There are a number of models out there, and so I eventually became proficient in using one of those models and have kind of followed up on some of Vardaman's work to look at the plausibility. And as you mentioned earlier in this show, exploring a model to see, does that model actually work, or are there some flaws in it? And so I've been doing that work for probably the last 15 years. Still a lot more to do, but that's my current work in the creation area.
Great. All right. Well, today's subject is the vapor canopy. First of all, why don't we start very simply here? Could you explain to us, as well as you can, some of the issues that come up when people try to model the canopy theory? I guess we'll just start with very general question.
Okay. Well, I think I'll probably start from the beginning, clear back with Vale. Really, there was a lot of argument from analogy. We look at Saturn, we look at Jupiter, we see a cloud-covered planet, we look at Venus. Maybe that's where the Earth was before the flood. And so then you start working through those issues. So one of the arguments against a cloud-covered Earth was the fact that you would not see the sun, moon, and stars, which would be a problem. So by the time we get up to the book that Dillow wrote, the conclusion was, if we're going to have a transparent atmosphere, we need to have water vapor as opposed to clouds. Now, I think there was some argument at one point of a crystalline shell around the Earth, that you would have clear ice so you could still see the sun, moon, and stars. The only problem is, if it's a static shell, it cannot structurally support itself and it would collapse under its own weight. It ends up that then they said, well, what if we have it spinning? Of course, if you have it spinning, then you can sustain like the rings of Saturn. But at the poles, you can't sustain that, and as a result, things would collapse at the poles. So even if you start reading through Vale, the argument was that over time, the rings of Saturn will eventually start migrating towards the poles and then collapse to the surface of the Earth or to the surface of Saturn. It's a bit of a misunderstanding of angular momentum, and so even that notion that Vale brought up was flawed. But you'll see it even in Dillow's work, where they'll talk about the Ice Age. The possibility is that a lot of the collapse of the canopy ended up, the very end of it, formed the Ice Age by collapsing ice on the poles. But physically, there are problems with that. So ultimately, it came down to, you have to have vapor, you can't have liquid water, you can't have ice. So then, of course, you start thinking through how much water you need. I think at the time of Dillow, they were thinking maybe like 30 meters, or 30 feet of water, about 10 meters of water. Now, that's still not anywhere close to what you need to cover the safe surface of the Earth. So even with Dillow's work, there was this loophole that you really can't explain all of the waters on the Earth to cause the flood. But it ends up that that depth of 10 meters or 30 feet, kind of interesting, because now all of a sudden it starts tying in with your argument of these hyperbaric conditions on the Earth's surface that causes longevity. It ends up that through barometric experiments, let's say hyperbaric chambers that have oxygen for healing, they set it around 2 atmospheres. It ends up that if you make the pressure too high in oxygen, it actually is detrimental to the body. And so it seems like there was a lot of thinking through what was the current science and trying to build how much water you might put in the Earth's atmosphere to give you the pressures that might be actually beneficial for long life. So you end up by getting things around 2.5 atmospheres as opposed to what we have a current 1 atmosphere pressure. So with that in mind, what happens when you have 30 feet or 10 meters of water in vapor form over the Earth? The analogy I like to think is in terms of what's called, I think in my textbooks when I was going through high school and even junior high, was the greenhouse effect. Now, I don't know in England if that was the term that was used, The idea that the Earth's atmosphere acts like a greenhouse that gives us a good climate for life to exist. Going through my PhD program, atmospheric scientists kind of cringe at the term greenhouse effect. They would actually like to use the term atmospheric effect. The fact is that the Earth's atmosphere needs to be here, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Not just because we wouldn't have anything to breathe, but also we would find out that the Earth's surface would be frozen. In fact, if you had no atmosphere, the average temperature of the Earth's surface would be negative 18 degrees Celsius, which is about 1 degree Fahrenheit for our American audiences. It ends up, because we have an atmosphere that absorbs infrared light that is irradiated from the Earth's surface, it traps some of that energy in the Earth's atmosphere and warms it up. So because we have oxygen in the atmosphere, because we have nitrogen, because we have water vapor, because we have carbon dioxide, etc., the average surface temperature of the Earth is 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. It ends up that gives us a nice, comfortable environment for the life that we see. It ends up that a lot of the discussions we have with regards to global warming is not because that the fact that we have warming, it's just where do you set the thermostat? Do you want the thermostat at 15 degrees Celsius, or do you want it at 16, or do you want it at 14? And it ends up that by the time you put in about 30 feet of water in vapor form, that trapping effect of the atmosphere gets amplified so that all of a sudden I think you have temperatures well up towards the boiling point. So we know that can't happen.
Right.
There must be some other explanation.
Yeah. Okay. So, Paul, did you have a question about that?
Well, okay, so there's clearly this problem with excessive temperatures on the surface of the Earth. And those who were modelling the canopy, I think, recognised this problem. Are there some features of the model that we can, we can play around with to try to ameliorate that temperature problem?
Oh yeah, there's lots of things, and in fact, I think Vardaman did some work looking at different parameters. Probably the most obvious one is to change the Earth's albedo. Now, the term albedo means how much of the sunlight that comes in on the Earth's surface actually gets reflected back out into space and does not get absorbed. The albedo of the Earth right now is about 30%. So 30% of the sunlight gets reflected out into space, 70% gets absorbed and used to essentially power life and atmospheric and ocean circulations on the Earth itself. So the obvious thing is, let's just pick the albedo up so that instead of the Earth absorbing 70%, what if the albedo is up around 75%, which means the Earth only absorbs 25%? You can change the albedo until the Earth's temperature comes out fine. The only question is, what's the mechanism for giving you such a high albedo? Now, if you look at ocean water, the albedo is probably more on the order of about 5%. So the reason we have a 30% is primarily because of clouds. So if you make the Earth completely cloud covered, you can kick the albedo up fairly high, but all of a sudden we're back to that cloud problem of not being able to see the sun, moon, and stars. And then again, if you're at the Earth's surface, you don't see anything beyond, maybe a couple miles up, and that's it.
Okay,
so there was sorry, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I wanted to break in here and mention. So we've talked about Larry Vardaman a couple of times now, and I wanted to make sure our listeners understood. Larry was a scientist at the Institute for Creation Research. He was there for a long time, and he was an atmospheric physicist, and he was interested in initially exploring the vapor canopy model and did work in the 80s on that. And he also did work on the atmosphere of the Earth after the flood. And he was interested in understanding, the ice age and ice cores. And so various various issues of atmospheric physics as they relate to origins. That was his work and contribution to creationism. So when we mention Vardaman's work, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about Larry Vardaman and his work basically modeling various atmospheric physics of creation and the flood. So back to you, Paul.
Yeah, so now Larry Vardaman, he was initially very positive about the vapor canopy model, and what he wanted to do was kind of bring some rigor in the modelling, and kind of take it beyond the work that Dillo had done in the late 70s and early 80s. What kind of work did Larry do with his graduate students at ICR, and what were some of the problems that he ran into in the course of that modelling effort?
Well, as I said, what you do is you can set up a very simple model that's a one-dimensional model. You slice the atmosphere into multiple layers, and then you attribute how the different layers are going to absorb different wavelengths of light. Now, right now, the atmosphere is relatively transparent to the visible light, which is, about 400 nanometers up to 700 nanometers. It's also transparent in the microwave range, but in the infrared, it's relatively opaque. So depending on the wavelength, you pick up different, you get different levels of absorption. And so if you throw water vapor in, it has very strong locations where it absorbs light. And all Vardaman did was, and I would assume this goes back to Glenn Morton's critique, you actually set up this computer model and you let it come to equilibrium. And so you have sunlight coming in, the Earth's surface heats up, it radiates infrared radiation off, and then each of these layers interact with that, and eventually you get just as much energy in the form of infrared leaving the atmosphere as coming in as light from the sun. And then you just determine what temperature corresponds to that. And so not only do you know the temperature of the Earth's surface, but you can actually infer the temperature at different layers within the Earth's atmosphere. And I think if you look at probably Glenn Morton's, and I think probably even in Dillo's book, he will have a temperature profile of the Earth's atmosphere. He has the atmosphere relatively hot above, but by the time you get to their surface, it's remarkably cooler. But what you're doing is you're playing games with what are each of these layers doing. Now, it's not necessarily a game for more modern scientists, because we can actually go into the laboratory. We can take a chamber with carbon dioxide in it, water vapor, et cetera, and we can send different wavelengths of light through and find out how they're absorbed and incorporate that into the model. So by the time you're doing the work that Vardaman was doing, Glenn Morton, absorption of the atmosphere is fairly well known. In fact, you have to go back over a century with Arrhenius. Arrhenius looked at the issue of infrared radiation as being why the Earth's atmosphere is, or I should say the Earth is warmer than if the atmosphere wasn't here. In fact, he actually proposed that if the Earth were to slip into an ice age, we should kick a bunch of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to heat things up. So we've understood infrared radiation with a lot of degree of accuracy from the laboratory as well as through observation. And so these models are very well vetted. And Vardaman realized that you can't get around the physical properties of the different molecules in the atmosphere and how they absorb different wavelengths of light. So you play the game with the albedo, but as I said, we can't really throw a bunch of clouds in without other problems coming in. So I think eventually Vardaman said, if you're going to have a significant amount of water in the atmosphere, you actually have to dim the sun down. So instead of the sun putting out as much sunlight as it does currently, you would scale it back considerably. Right now, the sun puts out at the top of the Earth's atmosphere about 1.5 kilowatts of power. So what if you make that only 750 watts? Scale it by a factor of 2. And again, you just have dials in your computer model, or I should say dials in your scientific model to actually make things reasonable. But the question is, do we have a rationale as to why the sun would be so dim in the past, but not dim currently?
Right.
Yeah.
That gets to the idea where you're sort of you're propping up your model on kind of ad hoc assumptions where you don't have any reason to think these other factors might be true. You're just going to stick it into the model because it saves the model and makes it work.
Yeah, and in fact, your model is really raising more problems than it's solving at this point, isn't it?
That's when you really start to you should at that point, when you get to the point of ad hoc propping up your model, you should step back and go, all right, maybe the model is just fundamentally flawed and is not salvageable, and I should be looking for a different model. That's a good thing to remember.
By the time you get to 1998, Vardaman, at one of the International Conference of Creationism conferences, did a paper, and it seemed to be about the last, I think, probably definitive work on the Canopy, where he concluded that no matter how you turn the dials, the most water you can put in the atmosphere is probably up to about a meter, or about 39 inches of water vapor, or if you were to precipitate it out, that much water in the form of water vapor is probably the most you can throw in without the Earth's surface being too hot to sustain life.
So this raises all kinds of, this is fascinating. This raises all kinds of questions then that people want answers to. If we're kind of throwing out the vapor canopy theory because we can't come up with a workable model, then what do we make of all of these Bible passages that talk about the waters above the heavens, the waters above the firmament? What was the source of the water during the flood? And all of these other questions. How do we explain the longevity of humans before the flood? Is there some other way, or perhaps ways, that we can explain these things without the vapor canopy?
I think there were answers that people had before they came up with the vapor canopy. I think from the biological realm, I think longevity is, at least from our current understanding, is probably better understood by genetics rather than hyperbaric conditions on the Earth's surface. I don't know, you haven't mentioned it before, but I don't know, in your readings, have you seen anything where people allude to this denser atmosphere actually allowing for there to be giantism?
Yeah.
Yes.
That somehow the atmosphere buoys up people, and therefore you can have much larger creatures than we see currently today. But again, we're talking, one atmosphere difference instead of 1 atmosphere, 2.5. The buoyancy of the atmosphere isn't going to support giantism. So again, it seems like you get a good model, and like any good hammer, or anytime you see a nail, anything you can grab is a hammer, right? And so you get things thrown into the pot that, at least at the current see how good this model is. It explains everything. But people had explanations for those things before the model came along. So one thing is you can go back historically to see how people answered longevity pre-Vale, maybe even back at the time of Jerome, as you alluded to, how they thought about it. But I think our current understanding of the genetics probably gives us a better framework for that. Waters above, we do have waters above. I mean, even currently we have waters in the atmosphere. Whether the waters above is a separation where it was recognition that there are clouds in the atmosphere versus with regards to the Earth's surface, we really aren't told how much water was made for the water above. But also, if you look at some of the recent creationist literature, there are a number that would say, well, possibly the waters above is on the cosmic scale. So now, if you go with somebody like Humphreys, with his model, he would say maybe at the very beginning of creation, when it says, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens of the earth, and the earth was void and without form, and water was upon the face of the earth, that maybe this is all of the initial matter of creation. And so by the time you get to day 2, where you're doing the firmament and you have the waters above and waters below, the waters below comprise the water that is currently on the earth, but the water above ends up by being all the other material from which God made the rest of the creation, which includes the sun, moon, and stars that show up on day 4.
Yeah, so it's not. There are other ways of understanding that, I guess, is kind of the point. The text of Scripture there is not. It's not written for us scientists who want to have an exact accounting, with numbers and formulas and photographs and diagrams showing exactly what the waters above are. It's just, there it is, and so we have the phrase, and I tend to think the simplest explanation is clouds. The ancients knew what clouds were. They knew that it was water basically suspended in the air, and that's where the rain came from. And so I suspect that that's just all there is to it. I could be wrong, of course, but that seems to me to be a perfectly plausible way of reading it. And I would also say, going back to the genetic point, that is unquestionably correct. There have been numerous studies of the genetics of life history. And this has gone on for, well, my lifetime, basically, since we've had good molecular biology and genetics and been able to study these sorts of things. And over again, we've found examples of particular genes that could be modified, and then they would extend the lifespan of an organism. We found them in mice, we found them in fruit flies. You could basically double an organism's lifespan with a pretty simple modification of their genes. So, and it's not a pleasant lifespan because you're decrepit and old for half your life, which is not fun. But you're twice as old as you were before. So. Yeah, when I hear people talk about how, if we only had, shielding from radiation, we could live to be 900. No, no, that would not work. And even, and I would add here, Dillo even recognized that back in 78. He understood the research just didn't really support the idea that environment causes the shortened lifespan of humanity.
I think along with that, you have to think in terms of the context of when these models were constructed. A lot of times we want to evaluate a model that was generated 50 years ago, 100 years ago, based on our current understanding. The time of Vale, let's see, we're talking Darwinian evolution. It has been essentially thrown in the forefront of science. But no mechanism of heredity was even understood at the time. And, it's not until the turn of the century that you actually start seeing some issues of what inheritance looks like. And then not until really the contribution of Watson Crick and others in the mix there. I'm trying to think of Rosalind
Franklin.
She tends to not get mentioned in the mix there, but she was very instrumental in our understanding of what DNA is. We can't necessarily fault Vale and others at the time trying to figure out, based on our current understanding of the world, what are plausible explanations. But as you mentioned before, we have to hold those models loosely because now, as our understanding of the details have become much more accurate and much more precise, that we have to really think through the model again and say, is this something that needs to be pushed off to the side? And that is there a better model that explains it more robustly? Historically, you can go back to the time of Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a Greek that somewhat summarized all of the Greek knowledge of astronomy. We have this idea of the Earth at the center of the solar system. We have each of the planets and the sun and moon at different spherical shells around the Earth, and that's their realm. The thing is, when Copernicus proposed his model to somewhat overturn the current thinking about what the universe looked like, there was a lot of resistance. Now, part of it was, the resistance was that Copernicus's model wasn't very good. Ptolemy's model could explain things with much more accuracy, much more precision, So what model do you choose? The one with more precision or the one that is intuitively more satisfying? Now,
Yeah.
it's not until you get up to Kepler that you actually get both in one. You get something that is intuitively satisfying, but at the same time provides the rigorous precision. And we need to rethink models on a constant basis to see, is there a better intuitive sense as to why things work the way they do, but at the same time provide the rigor and the precision that we expect from modern day science.
I think that's a great way to conclude. Paul, do you have any other thoughts here? I see by the clock on my recorder here we're about done with this episode.
Well, I was just going to say that there are also, of course, geological questions that kind of fed into the vapor canopy model. One was the assumption that the pre-flood Earth was uniformly warm and had this sort of uniform temperate climate. But in fact, from the geological record now, we think that wasn't correct. We have trees preserved in flood rocks, which presumably were growing in the pre-flood world, that show evidence of seasonality and frosts. And there appears to have been a different climate in the higher latitudes compared to the lower latitudes. So some of those assumptions didn't really stack up. And then, of course, we now have a model called catastrophic plate tectonics that helps to explain the source of the floodwaters without a vapor canopy. And in fact, I think probably does a better job of sort of taking seriously the role that the Bible gives to other sources of water besides the windows of heaven. We have the fountains of the great deep in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11. So we have water sources under the earth or in the oceans of the earth that appear also to have been a primary source of water during the flood. So our models have dramatically changed, and the vapor canopy model, which was proposed with good motivations and seemed to explain lots of things, it turns out that actually some of the things it was invoked to explain were not actually probably not true. This uniform climate idea, and others have other explanations.
And the best part about it is that the models have not changed for the worst. They've changed for the better, right? So we know more things now, and we can see it's not just that the vapor canopy's wrong, it's that we've got better stuff, much better stuff that explains a lot more data and is much more consistent with the actual data that we observe and know about in the modern world. And that is what we're going to talk about next time when we talk about the atmosphere and the flood and the post-flood climate. So I hope you will join us for that episode in a fortnight. That's 2 weeks for you Americans. So thanks for watching. Steve, how would we contact and learn more about the ICC coming up?
Well, we have a website. Yeah, it's International Conference on Creationism, all one word, no spaces in between, .com.
All right. International Conference on Creationism.com.
Announcements for call for papers. We are soon to have the author's manual up so that those that would like to contribute will be able to see what the expectations are. And then we'll have a site set up. And then, of course, the next International Conference on Creationism will be 2023 at Cedarville University.
And when that time rolls around, we go to that website also to get our tickets?
We'll have everything as far as registration, as well as events that will be going on during the conference itself. So it will be a site developing over time. We also plan on putting up some blog posts on a regular basis, primarily to get people excited about the upcoming conference, but also to reflect back on contributions from past conferences. So come by and visit our site and see what's coming up in a couple of years.
All right, sounds good. If you want to know more about our podcast, we are on all the major podcasting platforms. We're also on YouTube. We'd love your kind likes and good reviews and subscriptions. If you can subscribe, that would be great. That helps us out a lot to know the sorts of things that you're interested in and you would like to hear more about. You can find us on the web, coresci.org/podcast. And our ministry, Core Academy of Science, also at coresci.org. You can learn how you can donate to support us. And Paul, where do we go to learn more about Biblical Creation Trust?
Yes, we're at biblicalcreationtrust.org, and there's a donate button on our homepage which will take you to a giving page, and that tells you all of the options to help us keep this content coming.
All right. Fabulous. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Golmer, and we will see you next time.
Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.